Welcome to Kingdom Thinking, teaching ministry of Christ our King Community Church. My name is Matthew Hodges, and today I have the joy of sharing with you from the book by Dr. Jamar Tisby, The Color of Compromise. Now, in the month of February, we took a break to focus on women of the movement. We have some wonderful episodes, and I want to encourage you to take a look at those episodes and be blessed by them. Well, today we're going to return to the book that we started a few months before with Dr. Jamar Tisby. In his book, we have been journeying through each chapter and just want to give an overview of what Dr. Tisby is saying. The title of the book is Color of Compromise, the Truth about the American Church's Complicity in Racism. Now, the overall point of the book is to show that while there's been progress in fighting racism, historically the majority of the American church has failed to speak out against this evil. And this ongoing complicity continues to sabotage racial unity in the church today. Well, in today's episode, we're going to focus on chapter 8. And the title of chapter 8 is Compromising with Racism During the Civil Rights Movement. Now, as Jamar has done throughout this entire book, he uses a story-driven survey of American Christianity's racial past. Chapter 8 focuses on the Christian moderates, mostly white and evangelical, but also some black churches and ministers who played it safe, refusing to get involved in the civil rights movement. Now, chapter 8, the major stories center around Brown versus the Board of Education, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the Reverend Billy Graham, the American church, both black-led and also white-led. Tisby states in this chapter that at a key moment in the life of the nation, one that called for moral courage, the American church responded to much of the civil rights movement with passivity, indifference, or even outright opposition. He opens the book by discussing the story of Brown versus the Board of Education, Topeka, Kansas. And that was taken up by the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court removed the legal keystone that had propped up racial division in public spaces. But in doing so, it outraged segregationists. Listen to these two examples from the book. In 1954, J.T. Gillespie, a white pastor, and the president emeritus of a Christian school, Belhaven College in Jackson, Mississippi, argued to pastors in attendance at a regional conference a Christian view of segregation. Kerry L. Daniel, pastor of First Baptist in West Dallas, preached a sermon that was later adapted into a pamphlet entitled God, the Original Segregationists. But the bold stance and support for segregation by Gillespie and Daniel was not true of all. Tisby states that many were radical moderates, seeking to find a middle ground or a middle way between being active for or active against the civil rights movement. One of those individuals is the very famous Reverend Billy Graham. Billy Graham was a moderate. He, like many white evangelicals, held back from actively pushing for black civil rights. Now, Graham did a few things, and I grew up watching Billy Graham. Matter of fact, I went to a Billy Graham crusade in Washington, D.C. growing up. But Billy Graham didn't take the steps to fight against racism and segregation. Now, he did take steps to desegregate some of his crusades, and he even invited Dr. King to give the opening prayer at one of his rallies in 1957, which King accepted. But Tisby states Graham, like many evangelicals, believed race relations would gradually improve one conversation and one friendship at a time. Graham saw no need for laws to be changed, only hearts through evangelism. Graham avoided any countercultural stances that would have alienated his largely white audience and his supporters. Now, moderates were men and women who were actively against the civil rights movement and Dr. King. And they were not just white evangelicals. There were black Christians who opposed the movement. One of them was the Reverend Joseph H. Jackson. He was a powerful preacher, and I've had the joy of listening to his sermon as I prepared for this talk. Powerful preacher. You can find some of his sermons on YouTube. He was known by some as the Negro Pope. He was the pastor of Olivet Baptist Church in Chicago and president of the National Baptist Convention. He was the longest serving president of the convention. Now, Reverend Jackson was a friend of King's father, Daddy King, and he was a frequent guest, house guest, when Martin was a child. Now, Jackson strongly opposed the movement, and King in particular. Tisby states he labeled King a hoodlum and a powder keg philosopher, and he deplored the direct action campaign of the civil rights movement. This opposition led King and some two others to leave the denomination and to form the Progressive National Baptist Convention in 1961. Unlike Graham and Jackson, King recognized the necessity of changing laws to ensure the rights of all citizens, and he did not shy away from direct action. In closing, the Brown versus Board of Education decision by the Supreme Court offered a clear sign to segregationists that the federal government could no longer be trusted, and that the Southern way of life was once again under assault. Rather than engage in direct action, some white and black Christians opposed or were complicit by not courageously opposing the status quo. While not all moderate Christians were racist or feared integration, enough went along with the Jim Crow consensus. Unfortunately, the American church largely chose to compromise with racism through passivity, complicity, and rejecting yet another opportunity to come alongside black people in the nation's second Reconstruction. There's so many stories in chapter 8 that I can't share with you. And so I want to encourage you to buy the book and read it to yourself, read it to your children, and pass on. I think it'll be a blessing to you. Well, in Kingdom Thinking, we seek to apply Jesus' story to real-time stories. May you know this: Jesus Christ is no segregationist. He is actively saving men and women from every tribe, tongue, and nation. It says in Matthew 28, 19 through 20. And so men and women, they need to hear the gospel to be saved from God's wrath. And that is the responsibility of the church. But not only do we need to share the gospel, we need to live out the gospel. And part of living out the gospel is being able to speak up, as it talks about in Proverbs 31, for those who cannot speak up for themselves, to do justice. Justice is all through the Bible. And we need men and women to proclaim the gospel. And we also need men and women to live out the gospel. Martin Luther King, in his letter from a Birmingham jail, answered the question, how does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? And King wrote this: a just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. An unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. And so, the civil rights movement was moving against unjust laws. And so, Christ our King, we need to share the gospel, and we need to use our voice to speak up for those who have no voice, and need others to speak up against injustice and unjust laws. Look for the next episode of Kingdom Thinking. Grace and peace.